must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Harry, find your hair to be president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
This is Jeremy Rothkushel.
All right, we're here on Monday morning, the weekend after, what would you call it? The coup that wasn't, the putsch that wasn't. I guess there's a number of terms potentially for what may or may not have happened in Russia over the weekend. In fact, Jeremy, on Friday when we were recording our show about Robert Kennedy Jr. was when all of this was breaking. So we've been keeping an eye, or we've been looking at some of the narratives over the last couple of days. And of course, just like everybody else, we're still learning and finding out more of things that happen. But as far as we're going to use this time to about an hour or so to take a look at what we might think is going on based on narratives that are out there, based on things we've been following for a bit, combined with information that's out there, and maybe just a bit of a landscape of frustrating narratives coming from multiple sides of the aisle, both on the quote-unquote American/Western side and on the Russian side of things. And just spent about an hour here giving some of our thoughts on what may or may not have happened this weekend with the no longer just a hot dog vendor who once catered for Vladimir Putin, Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group. And
no, that's not true, Greg. I saw a meme on Telegram of that there were lines of hot dog carts on the road to Moscow via Tula. So that this is what happened. This Max Blumenthal is not discredited at all in all of this. This is still just an uppity hot dog vendor with all of his hot dog carters on their way to Moscow.
Now, who received $6 billion from the CIA to try and lead a coup against Putin.
Which remains an interesting question in terms of the potential. My evolving sense is there might have been a double cross in all of this, but we don't know yet. I think on the side of whether this might have been similar to the way that certain both U.S. and U.K. elements were approaching Deripaska, trying to turn Deripaska in the years actually approaching the 11/9 operation. People such as Steele and some of his contacts in the Christopher Steele and his contacts in the FBI, and then there were double crosses and all of that. We don't know yet in terms of the question of Prigozhin and whether it's related to missing slush funds in terms of Ukraine. And of course, if there were this case, it does seem like there are certain voices in especially the American sphere, who seem to be anticipating something more than what they received. And you'd have to look at the question, some kind of Ukrainian, UK, US potential involvement with an attempt to maybe turn Prigozhin and thinking that they were going to get something else from this. But, with the whole Russian deep state and the mafia state, especially how its leader for many, many years is well conversant and trained in all of the dark arts of intelligence, including counterintelligence and very highly layered, dolls, right? Russian dolls of layers of this. And so in general, I would say that all of these kinds of evolving or maybe devolving in terms of impact terms to describe whatever this was, from sort of starting as a coup, then sort of becoming a failed mutiny. And then I think also really at some layer, I think it's a staged putsch is the way I look at it. It's a staged putsch of a blow, a sort of staged blow at a certain part of the Russian state, very likely for interests of those who are in some massive control of the Russian state, is what it looks like to me. And maybe the double cross question has to do with whether there were those in the Ukrainian, UK, US sphere who who were double crossed potentially.
That's a good way to put it. And based on, I saw a little bit of CNN Friday night, and General Mark Hertling, who's one of their go-to military analyst commentators, was acting in a way that you would think, talking in a way that would lend credence to the idea that maybe there was some, at the very least, foreknowledge that something was going to go down, if not like an actual, serious effort financially and otherwise to try and make something happen. But there was the commentary on CNN combined with a tweet from General Hertling that he has a feeling that people in the U.S. know more about what is going on than Putin does. That was on Friday night. So there's definitely smoke to the fire, but it is all big. Like we're still a couple days out from this. Probably get more answers as time goes on. Who knows if we'll ever get all of the answers? But there is this cloud of confusion and a cloud of uncertainty around all of this, and that's almost, as we've talked about, with like maybe some of these methods of narrative warfare and Sokovian and all of this, that maybe it's designed and intended to be that way, where it's hard to tell what really is and is not going on. And Jeremy, we've been talking among ourselves. One thing we said was, because we've been talking about this for a bit, even going back to the anger of like the likes of Alexander Dugin towards like the war, they're not being aggressive enough and fighting the war, like, and we're losing. And then this goes back to this frustration and outrage towards the generals, Putin's top generals who are waging the war, which I believe Prigozhin was very critical of in speeches leading up to or public statements leading up to the attempted the events of the weekend. And Jeremy, we had compared this to if this is what's going on. We don't know if this is the case, but I certainly think it's as much of a possibility as anything else. And it's where my mind kind of leans toward, based on what we've analyzed and looked at over the course of time, is that in the United States, if we had something like this, there would be an equivalent. If this indeed was some type of like planned event of terms of like a power play against certain people that maybe had fallen out of favor within the military, or that this would be almost as if, like, say, Eric Prince and Michael Flynn were to have the means to make a public physical move against Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Mark Milley to the benefit of Donald Trump. I mean, there's a part of me that feels like, and you actually were the one that made this comment to me, that like planted this in me, and I think it makes sense. But if we're looking at it from that regard, like this could just simply be another element of like the quote unquote deep state, or maybe the people who have fallen out of favor for whatever reason, that this is a way of being of dealing with it. And this would also make sense in that, I'm not saying this is what's going on, it's just a scenario, but like it would make sense in terms of then like the you got a lot of people looking really bad, because then like this was the way that Putin was supposed to look incompetent. So Putin can be viewed by certain people as like this master chess player who's always steps ahead of everybody else. That's what Scott Ritter was saying with Alex Jones last night. They're so much smarter. Scott Bennett also, both of them were basically saying variations of how like the Russians are way ahead of everybody else and they're always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. So that would, or even then like it would just be a means to advance theirs. And also then the question of if there indeed was the financial factor with money going into try to foment this attempt to remove Putin, and it backfires. Like there's a lot of narratives that can come out of this, but I could see narrative warfare and narrative advancement going in a very and I thought there were a lot of people scrambling to try to explain this on like the Russian side when it first started, but now, and there's, of course, this is still early analysis, but I feel like this is a narrative that a lot of people, or an event that a lot of people could, if this type of scenario is correct, could use to in an advantageous way in terms of advancing narratives and talking points for a combination of reasons. If this was some type of master effort to remove the people who were becoming problematic for whatever reason in their waging of the war, and or the question of the money, if this financial aspect could be proven, or even really any type of serious credence lent to it, and it became like a conventional wisdom fact or conventional fact within these circles, then like it's really something that could be used to an advantage in terms of pushing narratives and almost from like a position of strength, so to speak. But if there was this at any level, though, the preemptive conclusions that a lot of people on the U.S. Western side jump to, I think it looks now like that was counterproductive, to say the least.
Oh, definitely. And it's one more indicator, I think, this Hertling example that you gave. And really, in general, like from him to Michael McFaul to all these people who are just, I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. But and then Hertling's assumption that U.S. intelligence implied knew more about what was going on than Putin, I think is indicative of the entirety of the post 11/9 era and the real deep problems from the American side, actually. And there's now, but maybe before we get into we should probably describe actually exactly what happened, how it is now sort of temporarily resolved, and then the potential outcomes here that we might see. But I do want to front end this by pointing out the meta narrative space here as you're beginning to get into, and the problems that are further highlighted, almost exacerbated in terms of this. From everyone from Hertling to McFaul to the Ann Applebaums to the whole, American establishment side, and how they're still trying to use certain kinds of aspects of narrative warfare. I would say you're right, even from the side of like trying to emphasize that this is a chink in Putin's armor. It shows he's weak. And there may be something to that, depending on the actual nature of these, what I would call false flag, sort of the inside job putsch, really, is what this looks like to me. It was very obvious from the beginning that Prigozhin, this is why I began to immediately, my instinct was to think of Eric Prince, gathering a few thousand Blackwater type guys on the eastern seaboard and marching up towards the swamp in Washington, D.C. And Mike Flynn is in the background waiting to take a position or something like that. And that this would all be done in something like either a parallel to January 6th or a follow-up to January 6th. And then let's say after this move by Eric Prince and the Blackwater types, then, as you pointed out, Milley, and we might then add on, the Secretary of Defense Esper were replaced by people like Michael Flynn and Kash Patel or Christopher Miller or Ezra Cohen Watnick, or these types at a key moment in terms of a certain kind of war effort.
So it would be like actually having like a physical means of the attempted and the replacing of the defense department between the election and between January 6th, basically.
Yes, and I also believe that it's actually sort of similar to January 6th, because January 6th was the American context of something like this. And to sort of say that Prigozhin was actually doing a coup against Putin would be similar to saying that if there were Michael Flynn, let's say, or Eric Prince involvement in January 6th, which is not beyond the pale, right, obviously, that they were doing a coup against the sitting president, Donald Trump, at that point. No, that's not what was going on. It was a putsch against a certain part of the government. In January 6th, it was obviously against the Congress, the legislative branch. It was also against the vice president to some extent. It was also against aspects of the security services, right? And then we saw what happened even just in the immediate wake of the election in 2020 in terms of who Trump basically totally replacing command staff level, appointments in terms of the nuclear security administration, and then obviously the whole Christopher Miller, Patel, Ezra Cohen Watnick move inside of the Pentagon, and all of that. So I see something sort of similar. In a shorthand, I would say that this begins to look like a very dirtied up combination of January 6th in a Russian context, where it's like really, fully blown in terms of like, Blackwater type, thousands of Blackwater troops going down the highway or something like that kind of context, right? Combined with the 2002 theater siege, where there's questions about whether there was obviously security services involvement behind the scenes in that, and some of it may have been actually forcing Putin's hand to some extent, combined with the failed Turkey quote-unquote coup that actually ended up really sort of re-establishing Erdogan's power. So those are the three, a combo of which I think we begin to actually get the sense of this. In no way do I believe this was actually just sort of like some sort of out of control, potentially suicidal or narcissistic, self-aggrandizing nut like Prigozhin, trying to actually make a move to replace the entirety of the Russian government, to decapitate it, to actually do a coup against Putin per se. Now, there might be deeper, longer term aspects in terms of the power structures, let's say the Russian deep state, the security service power structures that will potentially utilize this in terms of where Putin is in a compromised position, maybe even because of his potential involvement in it, or that he was put on the spot to some extent by this. But the whole Mark Hertling, idea, the sort of presumption that the U.S. knew more about what was going on than the Russians is just proof positive of really the fact that the 11/9 happened, the long-term cover-up of 11/9, the decades-long Russian intelligence operations, and then the combination of all these other national interests from the Middle East, and especially Netanyahu and MBS and MBZ in terms of the 11/9 operation, and how overconfident in many ways the American perspective is. And I think the shorthand for it is that if you look at like geopolitics or geostrategy, and then add on top of that intelligence operations, just sort of brute intelligence operations, let's say we're in a spy war, a global spy war of some sort, that there's these different game approaches, I think, to the matter. And in general, one of the main places where a domestic intelligence service will fail in relationship to their, what they see as potential nemesis or potential allies who are actually competitors or back channels to nemesis, such as the whole conversation around Israel to in terms of Russia and China, that the big failure is usually is not understanding a different perspective, and not understanding that not everybody's playing the game from your perspective. So I almost get the sense like the American perspective is like we're in a football game. And so it really matters about who has the best personnel, the strongest personnel. In that case, it's like technology. I think it's obvious that, that over the entirety of the last, at least since the Cold War, the United States has been way ahead in terms of technology that would serve both military and intelligence brute force in many ways, including satellite technology, cyber technology, but military technology too. And so there is a sense of that, okay, we have a bigger offensive line in many ways, so we're going to win this thing because we're playing football. And if you think strategically about football, there's not really game-long strategy in terms of football. It's usually play-by-play to some extent. Sure, most of the game-level strategy in football has to do with personnel, who you have, like who's your quarterback, who is your offensive line, who is your receiver, defensive line, all of that kind of thing. And it's the strategy is more like just sort of logistics. play by play, and sure, you do a little bit of like head fakes every now and then. You pretend to go one way and go the other way, but there's not the long-term game long strategy that you have in something like chess, where I would say the Russians are playing, they play chess, and sort of deceptive strategy or gambits where you're trying to trip up your opponent into forcing a mental blunder of some sort is built into the long-term strategy of chess. So then the Chinese are probably playing something more like Go, a game of strategy, of long-term strategy, but it's not really sort of, two sides facing off in a single line of combat that chess really is, where you're trying to get behind lines and stuff like that. Go represents more of a, trying to take territory over time and create pincher moves of where you then surround the, your opponent and then take over their territory. So you then think of that in terms of China's economic expansionism. So it's so obviously pointed out truthfully that China does not have all of these military bases around the world like the United States does, which represent this sort of more like brute force football type of power. But China has all these economic pincher moves going on everywhere, right, around the globe. And so they're playing a game of Go. And then one last thing, you throw in the Israelis, and I'd say they're playing a game of poker, right, where there's a and one more thing I want to point out is that they're, in general, both football, chess, and Go are all sort of like open. There's a lot of open. The actual battle, the sort of theater of the battle is all open, right? It's everyone can see the board, everyone can see the field. So sure, there's sort of secrets in the mind in terms of, you don't know what your opponent's planning to do, but the actual theater is out in the open. Now with poker and the Israeli approach to, I think, spy war and geopolitics, there's a lot of bluffing. There's a lot of sort of holding your deck close to yourself so that your opponents don't know what's going on. Then you got to think about who owns the house or who owns the dealer in big poker games that are sort of black market. You'll even have instances where you'll have like mobsters come in and sort of shake everybody down for using brute force in the middle of it. You can think of that as like a 9/11 kind of operation, I think. In terms of the way that the Israelis play. So a lot of I think the real failings of the American side in all of this, at least in public, in terms of the public, what's going on. Now, this might also be going on privately in terms of, into the CIA and stuff, if they had aspirations in all of this. But I think there needs to be a reckoning about the fog of war and really not playing the same game that the Russians are. And really, in general, I think that it has to be recognized that over the long term, from sort of pre-Bolsheviks and sort of Tsarist Russia and the beginnings of like the Okhrana, and then all into the different forms of Soviet intelligence and domestic and security services, and then now into this sort of post-Soviet Union sort of Russian mafia state run by Putin and his people, that there is a real strong grasp of the human intelligence matters and how you keep things secret, how you play your opponents, how you turn people, how you turn masses of people in terms of information and quote unquote movement building and culture war and mass media dynamics in a way that still is totally minimized, and that people who should know better by now, I think, especially in these sort of American contexts, are still just falling into these traps to some extent. And so that's where I think like what's really glaring right now in terms of the public media response that includes former American officials and generals and stuff like that. So I'd like for us to sort of see if we can sort of ferret out what might actually be happening and then the potential implications of this moment. Because in general, I see a split. I have a hopeful concept of if this is correct, what we're saying, that this is some kind of inside job thing rather than an organic or foreign sponsored failed coup by Prigozhin. Where might this be heading, and what might be the reasons for that? And I have one hopeful explanation that would include a sort of saving face of the winding down of the Ukrainian invasion. And then I have a more dark and dangerous moment potential in my mind in terms of that this is hardliners and escalation potentially, even specifically around Ukraine. So I'm not sure what the truth is, but I'm fairly certain that that our sort of like base analysis that this is some kind of Russian operation, I think is correct.
Yeah, and that would still apply even if there was like this big move in terms of like it would still be an operation in that like potentially something like this has been in the cards for a bit, and at the very least in this scenario, that would mean that the West, as we said before, was played by this idea of this big split, and then ultimately the results of it came to fruition. So I'm with you on that. I like the sports analogies, and I like the Russian chess dynamic explained in a manner where it's not like this. What you hear either from like Putin is just so far ahead of everyone because he's so much smarter, or the even more nonsensical QAnon-esque Trump is playing chess. Well, so I enjoy I like hearing the chess, the sports analogy laid out in a manner that doesn't just like advance the greatest people that walk in the face of the earth are so much smarter than everybody else. They're just way ahead. So I appreciate the nuanced take on the chess game.
Just call it multicultural, intersectional, open source analysis. Just joking.
And you mentioned Israel. I just want to throw in real quick that this might have been something that resulted from this, from the events of the weekend, but I believe it was the Ukrainian ambassador to Israel who was most publicly critical we've heard Ukrainian officials yet of Israel's at best reluctance and at worst to help Ukraine, and at worst basically backing of the Russian side in this whole thing. So that's something that I think came out of this events of the weekend. So like this also could result in more or even more public pressure being put on the Netanyahu government to take a stand publicly, or to more or less try to assert where it stands in all of this. And that goes on also at the same time as, I believe, Arnon Milchan testified in Netanyahu's corruption trial. So more interesting things going on with the Israeli aspect of this, with what might have been maybe the biggest Ukrainian, or at least from an official, in terms of a diplomatic standpoint, open criticism of Israel's stance or lack thereof in this whole ever since the invasion.
I think it even escalated. I think Zelensky said something very direct about the Israelis being on the wrong moral side of this and being non-committal, and all of that. So I agree that there's something there in terms of shifting dynamics here, and you're right. This all happens at the same time as Arnon Milchan. Who, by the way, right, then the Oliver Stone connection there, and Oliver Stone's newest Arnon Milchan, is sort of cheap cutout version of Arnon Milchan, Lopatnik, was on sort of these major Twitter spaces explaining what was going on. And as we pointed out before, you just sort of look at someone's Twitter feed, and you can begin to see just the sort of real base archetype of what they're about. And I pointed out before, and I'll just reassert this, that I think that the Twitter feeds of Oliver Stone's Ukrainian quote-unquote documentaries producer, maybe executive producer, Igor Lopatnik, is very similar, and lots of what you standard MAGA fare, Sobiek and all kinds of just the Scott Ritter and the whole litany is very, very similar to Scott Ritter's wife. I would say very likely a Russian honeypot wife, still ongoing, it looks like to me. And this also looks very similar to George Papadopoulos, patient, actually ground zero, right, of the actual origins of the Crossfire hurricane investigation at the FBI in terms of Trump Russia, and not the Steele dossier, but George Papadopoulos, who was thought to have actually been some kind of a foreign agent for Israel, but also in apparent trying to be, create communications with the Russians and all of that. That George Papadopoulos' wife's Twitter feed is very similar to Lopatenik and Ritter's wife, and so I think this is one way that you can do some counterintelligence analysis, is just look at the sort of who these people are signal boosting in terms of their Twitter feed. But so the fact that Milchan is now in the hot seat, or helping put Netanyahu in the hot seat in terms of Netanyahu's corruption trials. I think there's 3 different cases that he has against him, and I think more than one actually involved Milchan. And then the fact that Milchan was this former key producer, executive producer for Stone, who, as we pointed out in our last recording with RFK Jr., who's just gone more off the deep end, I think, in terms of the Russian sphere, and is interviewing Scott Ritter, or he has, I think, had Scott Ritter on his podcast, right? So he's not getting interviewed by Scott Ritter. He's interviewing Scott Ritter as the expert, right? And the fact that as we pointed out last time, RFK Jr. admits that his sort of getting woke or seeing the light in terms of the Trump Russia or Russia Gate hoax or whatever comes directly out of Oliver Stone and his son Sean Stone, and Sean Stone obviously directly tied in to both Russian state media and Iranian state media. And then Oliver Stone's so-called documentaries, whether they're for HBO, where it was much more sophisticated, the Putin interviews, much more sophisticated, I would say propaganda of some sort, much closer to the source in many ways, more interesting subject matter there, than versus his Lopatenik Ukrainian documentaries that are really, really crude propaganda when you begin to look at them, I'd say. So this is, and then at the same time as all that is going on, you have this is in the middle of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and then there's a lot of the Western commentators that are like, this is going to be a big boon immediately to the Ukrainians who will take advantage of this. And meanwhile, it looks, the Wagner group had sort of finished up in Bakhmut, and basically nothing changed. There was no distraction, it looks like, at the Russian front line, the actual official Russian state military front lines in Ukraine, that the Ukrainians were able to take advantage of. And this is one last point I want to make in terms of still sort of pervasive misunderstanding about what Prigozhin and Wagner actually are. People keep calling it a private military contractor, like as if it were very similar to Eric Prince, and obviously we've seen Eric Prince then sort of does all these knockoffs, or these sort of subsidiary type or parallel kind of logistics organizations like Frontier Services Group, and he's obviously been contracting himself out and his services to foreign states, especially China, which became the final line cross, but by people like his former executive Greg Smith, and then also Admiral Fallon and all that.
Yes, Greg Smith, by the way, he has asserted that his belief that Prince basically shifted entirely overseas, first to the United Arab Emirates and then to China, after he had a belief that Prince probably burned his domestic intelligence sources after all the controversy around the Nisour Square massacre and other things that Blackwater was involved in. So,
yeah, and so I think there's also a misunderstanding of that Prigozhin and Wagner are some kind of like Eric Prince Blackwater or foreign, or what's Frontier Services Group, and then it's not. It's not actually a private military contractor, both in terms of its origins, the real super closeness of Prigozhin to Putin over the years. The background, there's a troika of figures with the background in St. Petersburg, Moscow politics, which is Putin, Prigozhin, and Borodin. I think you got to look at that, and then the question of blackmail in the middle of all of that is key to understanding this, and that a lot of it has to do with compromat, and all the way on down to sexual compromat. And Prigozhin appears to have not even been just a quote unquote hot dog vendor, but he was more of like something like maybe the background of the former head of Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel. What's his name again, Greg?
Avigdor Lieberman.
Avigdor Lieberman,
yes.
The former Moldovan club bouncer of some sort, right?
This is much, much more than a hot dog vendor who once catered for Vladimir Putin, who maybe invested several $1,000s into Buff Bernie memes on Facebook.
Yeah, into like exactly a sort of an over celebrated hot dog vendor who bought a few $1,000s of boosted Facebook shit posts or something like that. So hopefully that now that he was marching with thousands that toward took Rostov, key military city, including questions of tactical nukes in terms of Rostov, on down through around Tula. And then it looks like they stopped somewhere around Tula, but on the road to Moscow. And by the way, Tula is important because it's a Dayumin is this figure. We'll get into that maybe next after we finish up this question of that Prigozhin, what Prigozhin's background here, and that Wagner is not a private military contractor. But Prigozhin's actual background, it looks like, in terms of as he came up, as sort of Putin came up, Putin comes up obviously via KGB and intelligence and counterintelligence in Germany, and then comes back into the heartland, and then is coming up through the municipal government and lots of the work around integrating the mafia into the mafia state in many ways, and maintaining these relationships with these sort of crucial Russian mobs operating in, and some of them not even just Russian, potentially Israeli connections, Chinese connections in terms of Moscow. And but Prigozhin looks like he was on to, sort of setting up clubs and special rooms and young women, maybe underage girls for certain clients and all of that, and compromat, and remember, like, one of the things that Putin did early on as a favor, it looks like, to Pavel Borodin, who we will get into more as we continue on down this path, and Borodin's apparent interaction, and I'd say probably a deal with the quote-unquote Epstein-Maxwell sheriff whistleblower, the now Russian correspondent Daria. It was actually done this video with Daria Dugina before she died. That Borodin had this some kind of like probably trade of compromat with John Mark Dugin, and in terms of Dugin being brought in as a political refugee at these key times. The first meeting is 2013. I pointed out, remember Trump, Moscow 2013, the Phil Ruffin plane. This is the time of the allegations of the PP tape and the Moscow Ritz-Carlton and all of that. But then early 2016, right around the time that someone like Arthur Finkelstein is being brought into the Trump campaign, and someone like Paul Manafort that eventually sort of takes the helm, and his service apparently to Oleg Deripaska in 2016 to the Trump campaign, that then John Mark Dugin skips town in the United States and goes on a many thousands of miles journey to all around the United States, and then gets into Canada, and then gets himself to Russia. And so Putin's early solid that he did Borodin was actually using compromat against a public corruption prosecutor that was investigating Borodin for corruption that involved even, a sort of Swiss-Italian border. Mabetex, I think it was named, right, Greg? Something like Mabetex company that was getting all these contracts for building
Yes.
Moscow, and it was tied in directly to Yeltsin's family, his daughter, I believe.
Payments to Boris Yeltsin's daughter, I believe, and the one of the very first things Putin did after he took office officially was to give a lifetime immunity to Boris Yeltsin.
So there you go, and so there's something here, right? In
There's
terms
a little
of
more going on than just simply Putin the hero saving Mother Russia from the gluttonous, incompetent drunkard Boris Yeltsin.
right, and then that ties into the question of what is sort of stunning to those the people who are trying to use it in the West a lot to point out that this is a crack in Putin's armor, and the fact that he didn't immediately put down the traitor dog Prigozhin and immediately sort of got him a safe ride out to Belarus. And the charges are all dropped and everything, and he didn't put him down like the traitorous dog that he is. That this is something that has existed before with Putin in terms of where he comes into power, where he's elevated into power. He didn't do those kinds of things to people he might have been able to, such as Yeltsin or Borodin, and very likely in relationship to sort of potential questions, not only of power dynamics, but existing, and probably still to this day, existing mutual compromat, right? Though that's the chatter around Prigozhin because of his closeness geographically and long-term relationship to Putin, not only as his chef, but back to these real sort of street-level mob ties to the Moscow municipal government. But that there's compromat that goes probably both ways. It goes all ways. And so final point is that what Wagner should actually be called, and the actual proper analysts in this realm, I think, call it this, is a semi-state security group. I would actually call it a crypto state or a deep state security group. It's not a private military contractor in the form of a Eric Prince. This is obviously a way of utilizing the rise of private military contractors, especially in the West, and utilizing that concept and then deploying it as some kind of covert arm of the Russian government to gain all of the benefits, which includes things like not having to deal with what are recognized state military members to laws of war or certain reporting aspects and all of that kind of stuff. So that's one thing I think to really point out. This is not a PMC. This is not a private military contractor. This is a semi-state or covert state or crypto state operator that Putin helped set up, and that he has a deep, very likely mutually compromised relationship with this founder, with the sort of CEO type. Now, the actual military founder, I believe, comes out of GRU, out of Russian military intelligence. And there's a question here all along the way in terms of FSB and GRU. At the surface level, this sort of looks like a GRU inside job putsch of some sort. But then the questions are that some of these GRU characters might actually be sheep-dipped FSB types who are actually much closer to Putin and his background in the FSB. And that includes both of these characters who I believe we should look at as potentially fulfilling the recognized, what Prigozhin actually said he was about, is that Prigozhin said that he wanted to replace what sounded like the perfume princes, right? That kind of rhetoric, and these sort of failed kleptocratic bureaucrats from the Russian Ministry of Defense, such as Shoigu, the defense minister, and then Gerasimov, the chief of general staff. And so we should still look for that. And that will, once again, if that happens, that will then be said to be by this sort of like duped Western media as some kind of showing that Putin is giving Prigozhin what he wants. Whereas I think this very likely is actually much more of a Putin very likely in the mix interest at work here. And then final thing I'll say in terms of what it looks to me like what Prigozhin was actually saying and what it's actually servicing in terms of, if you were thinking about the narrative warfare level of this, is that we're at the time, remember when the Iraq War, the American Iraq War, began to show that it was a bad move, and it was getting really bad in Iraq, and it was not just sort of like a few months to democracy or something like that. And in
a cakewalk,
a cakewalk, right? They will welcome us with flowers and that kind of scenario. That once that began to get in the mix, then you have the push of, well, who is to blame for this? This is the oil billionaires, and this is the sort of these Bush cronies or something like that.
I think in an official administration capacity, Donald Rumsfeld kind of took the fall for the failure of the Iraq War.
Right. So you had a combination, right, of Tenet, who directly said he was a scapegoat, sort of the Tenet, Colin Powell, that sort of like state intelligence, and then for the military, you had Rumsfeld being the scapegoat. So that I do think that there's a part of this that really, in terms of for domestic public consumption in the Russian sphere, this is a scapegoating moment. It's a venting moment as this Ukraine special military, whatever they're calling it. But the Russian war on Ukraine goes drawn out. It's a slog. It's not just sort of like, and remember, Prigozhin actually said if Wagner had been in charge, we would have marched directly on Kyiv and taken it out instead of these perfume princes, knuckle dragger kleptocrats running the Russian military at this point. And then the other narrative,
similar to how Trump would describe someone like Mark Milley, who he now says, I would never have him leading in a position of war. So there's a similar type of mindset being laid out there with that type of rhetoric.
It's true. It's like the way Trump, the sort of the American version of this it went or would go in terms of Trump rhetoric was more like how you would attack a liberal democratic state. You have Esper, who's a sort of a perfumed corporate executive who didn't have the willpower to actually really put down the anarchists and these Marxist sympathizers and Black Lives Matter and Antifa in the way they needed to be put down. So I had to do it myself. Or Mark Milley, who's just too woke, having, sniffed too many critical race theory book farts or something like that to be able to do the hard work of killing the enemy or something.
Right. Yeah.
And so this comes out of more like a Soviet background, right, where it's like the idea of these incompetent, entrenched bureaucrats. And to be honest, it sort of seems accurate when you just sort of get a sense that you look at them. When you look at Shoigu and Gerasimov, they don't seem like real, they don't stand very straight. They don't seem quite competent. They seem sort of muddled and all of that. And so you hear Prigozhin, he said one of the most striking things that came out of this actually was one of the earliest statements Prigozhin made was basically that this war didn't have to happen really, and that this was a construct, that this was basically, it sort of sounded like AnteDote calling out Sputnik Radio a little bit, and our Deep Ukraine series a little bit, talking about the workup, the manufacturing of the dirty war and the Donbass and all of that. But the thing that Prigozhin says is that this was, first of all, the war shouldn't have happened, but it happened because of corrupt oligarchs. Okay, right? And so then what that then links in was what Alexander Dugin finally said about this, I think a day or two later, is he said that this is pointing to a problem of the elite, that we need a new elite, right? So this is what you're going to look for, I think, in terms of specifically the question of the oligarchs. And this almost seems like a Putin 2.0 in terms of the disciplining of the oligarchs, and Dugin and Prigozhin indicating that there is a a corrupt elite that was to blame for this, and that we need a more Russian nationalist elite that are disciplined to the interests of the state and its actual leader. So I think that's one thing that's going on here. So in the middle of the scapegoating, and we'll look to see if there's actually bureaucratic, like, scapegoats such as Shoigu and Gerasimov in the middle of this. But there's also this bigger, more sort of Russian body politic approach as people get a little bit disgruntled with this, how potentially, long and drawn out and badly the war is going in terms of a slog, that there's this idea of these elite oligarchs who don't actually have Russian interests in mind that were the cause of this. And then you have these corrupt bureaucrats, Shoigu and Gerasimov, who didn't get done what we could have done, so-called in the private sector, right? So there is going to be this thing of I believe you're going to see a few things. Go look for what the actual laws that are passed in the wake of this. I think you're going to see a few things. You're going to see, one is there going to be a further refinement in terms of Wagner is sort of blown out now. It's sort of well known. It's African operations are known. It's global operations are fairly well known at this point. So they're gonna sort of bring Wagner more closely into the recognized command and control parts of the Russian military state. And then combined with that, I think you're going to see things that are similar to the wake of the 1999 Moscow bombings, where you're going to see things like that have to do with powers of the state, and at this point Putin to be able to root out alleged sedition and treason and espionage at home, especially in relationship to the security state or war and that kind of thing. So those are some of the things I think to look for in the domestic side of the wake of this in Russia.
Well, thank you for that. The whole thing about Prigozhin, because these types of dynamics here with the mutual compromise, potentially the long-term relationships, these are things that remain true regardless of the truth of what happened or didn't happen over the weekend, because these types of dynamics do not change regardless of whether this was a false flag, false putsch style thing, whether this was some type of real split within within the camps, or whether this was some type of Western financially concocted effort to try and remove Putin to some level or another. This reality doesn't change in terms of these long-term relationship dynamics. So it's way more plausible than either he's a nobody who was just given a bunch of money to try and upstage Putin, or he's just some egomaniacal hothead who started wearing, got too big for his britches, as a Ryan Dawson would say, hypothetically speaking. So these things do not change, and they have to be taken into consideration. We have to have a long-term, deep political relationships are always going to be a factor, and they need to be put out there, because otherwise then you won't, there's going to be important context that's going to be missing and of course that's one of the things that it does get done well in some areas within media, within our narrative, but it's not nearly done as well as it needs to be. Of course, the deep political aspect we've talked about is the lack of this is one of the big reasons, I think, why we're in a situation that we're in, is a lack of willingness to confront deep political realities and of these types of relationships, and the idea of long-term potential long-term compromise, whatever's going on here, and all of the factors at play with a long-term relationship like this. So I'm glad you've laid that out. And I'll also say that if Wagner in the future, it's going to be, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny around the name of Wagner, potentially even perhaps within some of the pro-Russian anti-imperial circles, because now that the conventional belief within a large sector of people who are into maybe more Russia-friendly narratives, information sources is that now the head of Wagner tried to remove Putin and all this. So now, if Wagner is going to be anything that comes around its name now, it's going to be met with much more scrutiny because, isn't this the guy? So now, then anything from like the motives to the have to be questioned much more significantly than before, and it's going to be much harder to just portray any Wagner as just like Western warmongering demonization of anything Russia or anything that's seen as Russia does geopolitically or on the global scale. So.
Definitely. And maybe I guess I'll finish up on my side by finally describing what actually happened. That's sort of it's my want to sort of end with the lead, I guess, or end with the actual who, what, when, where, why, how kind of scenario. But I in general, I think that sort of some analysis here in the kind of way that you're talking about is more important necessarily than every sort of people who want to go find the facts of what happened can go find them. But I still don't really see much, if any, of this sort of deeper analysis.
It's part of when you consider the why and the how, like this is these are vital to both. These are vital in terms of, as much like we talked about, you have to, that these have to be taken into consideration when you're looking, when you put the model, and particularly the why and the how, this type of information is vital to understanding of that.
Yes, I agree, and so here's I think what to look for, and this especially if it is the case that this is a what we might call a potentially double-crossed inside job false putsch or false flag putsch. And that to some level, at the very least, people, some of the power structures surrounding Putin were in on it, if not just Putin himself. And it's beginning to look like there were actually just direct back channels going on here between Putin and Prigozhin, and that this whole Lukashenko had to step in to be the mediator thing is just for public consumption. And back to the Hertling hypothesis, because of the Russian prowess at human intelligence, there's no way that if U.S. intelligence had any kind of either foreknowledge or for involvement in this, that Putin himself wouldn't have known exactly what was going on with Prigozhin. It sounds absurd to me, right? So let's just say that this is the case, that this hypothesis is correct. And what you have is a combination of a perfect venting and scapegoating moment in terms of the difficulties and sort of to this point, sort of failures to actually complete the quote unquote mission in Ukraine by Russia on one side, and then potential other bigger security state, deep state kind of measures on the other. Here's what you look for. You'd look for a man named Alexei Dayumin, who is the Tula governor actually at this point, and that's a town that's sort of about 200 kilometers outside of Moscow to the south, right? Because Wagner sort of marches in from their operations from having been pulled out of Ukraine, and then they go to Rostov, which is about 1,000 kilometers south of Moscow. There also are questions. They easily march in there in terms of the military command headquarters. And Prigozhin actually sits the commanders down there on some kind of film and reads them the riot act and all of that, and tells them to not talk to him like it's friendly, and that he's actually in the command. And then from there, they then roll up the road towards Tula, and then apparently stop somewhere around there, I think. But this Alexei Dayumin guy, the Tula governor, background in Russian military intelligence, GRU. I think he helped head up the taking of Crimea. But most importantly, in terms of the dynamics surrounding Putin, he was, I think, maybe the head of security for Putin during the key years of 1999 through 2007 in that kind of realm. Okay. So in another kind of way, hearkening back to if this were an American context and Eric Prince with Michael Flynn in the background were marching on Washington or something like that. And then immediately thereafter, what's the guy's name? Kurt Schiller?
Keith Schiller.
Keith Schiller and Michael Flynn were then put into these positions, something like that. It would be similar to that. And then would that mean that Eric Prince was actually a threat to Putin, and it was actually a threat to Trump, and Trump was taken aback and sort of showed the chink in his armor that now his former head of security, long-term head of security, was now put in charge of these positions? No. Okay. So that's one thing. These are indicators, I think, factual indicators of what's actually, who did it, why, what's going on. Alexei Dayumin comes in to replace Shoigu as the defense minister. And then the other potential figure here would be General Surovikin, who would then potentially be brought in to replace Gerasimov as the chief of general staff. And I believe Surovikin actually has the direct background in relationship to Wagner. And then both of these would bring in questions of FSB in GRU, or the sort of the management of the relationship between the FSB and GRU. Okay, so that's what I think we might want to look for in terms of these personnel moves. And then the final thing we need to look out for in terms of these, my sense of the more optimistic way that this could go. Let's say that this was let's say Putin actually wants to wind down this war and doesn't want this to sort of be drawn out anymore, that this would be a way to do it and to save face to some extent as some kind of response to this. Now, I think that's a little bit hopeful. That's my hope that this could be, and that they're then, send Prigozhin and then readjust Wagner. Wagner was not going to stop operating all around the world in Africa, but maybe there's a new alignment or a new mission for Wagner. And by the way, there's other even more sort of high level and sort of secret kinds of semi-state or crypto state or deep state security groups in the Russian sphere that aren't talked about as much. And maybe we'll go into some of that later on. So, but the fact that Prigozhin and Wagner start at Rostov, claim some of these, entrance to the military headquarters, but there's also I believe there's tactical nukes in that in that area. And then the fact that Putin had just moved tactical nukes to Belarus. And then the fact that then is Prigozhin is given a SUV escort right out to Belarus, and that Putin really over a long period of time looks at Belarus as a newly reacquired satellite of his sort of Soviet Russian Empire 2.0 kind of operation, that the Ukraine operation is really a piece of. So that's what I think we want to look out for. People are pointing out too. Now, I think this is a little bit of a canard potentially, especially since it's mainly Prigozhin who's the one who's been transferred to Belarus. But people are pointing out that this is now much closer to Kyiv than they were before, when they were more on this sort of northeastern border of Ukraine. And so that's something to look out for. But of course, troop movement is something that the Ukrainians and their, American, NATO, UK backers with probably commanding satellite presence in the area would know, I would think, that this is not some kind of just easy way to transfer tens of thousands of Wagner troops from the eastern, part of the conflict to right above Kyiv. But I do think the move of Prigozhin himself and how they're sort of boosting Lukashenko's central role in this politically is crucial to understand, because for a long time now, in terms of this Ukraine war, Wagner and Prigozhin have been celebrated very much in terms of like in a massive way in Russia, where you see people on the streets celebrating them, even in the wake of some of this quote unquote failed putsch. So they are still seen as celebrated as Russian war heroes. And so I almost get a very big geopolitical reason in terms of Belarus, Lukashenko, Prigozhin, and the move there, but then also in the immediate wake of Putin moving the tactical nukes. Now, so that's my darker concern, is that this actually represents a brinksmanship type of move in relationship to both to provoke, but also in response to certain Western moves. Remember, there was the question of depleted uranium that the British were moving in. Now, that could have been just a threat. I think they was moved in, but then the Russians, I believe, blew it up immediately, the armament depot potentially. So, the UK is sophisticated enough to know that the Russians would be able to track it and target it and all of that. And so you get a sense of that there's some kind of brinksmanship going on. Now, my hope is that the brinksmanship will head soon towards de-escalating this war in some kind of settled peace. But my concern is that the moves of the tactical nukes, the relationship of Rostov to tactical nuke locations, and then Prigozhin to Belarus could indicate a kind of conflagration move or a pre-conflagration move, even in relationship to Ukraine, if not obviously in relationship to Russian global operations in terms of Africa and minerals and all of that. So that's what I'm looking at, and that's some of my concern.
Well, we will. Well, thank you for that, and we will definitely be keeping multiple eyes on this as we go forward. This is not the first or last time we'll be talking about any of this. Obviously, as I think we will find out more, hopefully going forward. But maybe from a Western perspective, as somebody who lives in the United States, who and it maintains a healthy criticism both of U.S. foreign policy, but then also sees actively the actual serious damage that has been done by these very real, very hostile foreign threats domestically, not just geopolitically, but domestically right here in our own country. I hope that maybe some people will maybe look again at how they assess things in the immediate aftermath of something, because this gloating and this for premature victory lap that was taken in some areas, is just to say it's counterproductive would be an understatement. But we'll definitely be keeping an eye on this, Jeremy, and thank you for bringing in a lot of the specifics of the names and the relationships at play with this, because and it's been very helpful. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for doing this quickly. A quick disposal here this morning, at least for us. And always remember Jack Posobiec's Belarusian military wife.
And he was seen reading, I believe, 21st Century Mind Wars has laid this out. We'll put a link in to his website and his work. Of Jack Posobiec reading Alexander Dugin, I believe, being photographed at, might have been at CIA headquarters or vicinity of CIA headquarters, reading Alexander Dugin in the immediate lead up to the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, where Alexander Dugin appeared on InfoWars, I believe, either for the first or second time, to give his philosophy to Alex Jones's audience. So,
yes, right, exactly. All right. There's always much more to talk about, but we will do that next time. And thank you again, Greg.
Okay. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody out there. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.